good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This. Tonight on the show, we're going to be looking at how China deals with the political, economic and social fallout from the COVID-19 outbreak. Joining us on the show, we have Professor Woo Wing Thye, professor at Sunway University. He's also with the Institute of Population and Labour Economics of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Great pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. I'd like to begin with some of the comments that China watchers have made. In fact, they've likened the COVID-19 crisis for President Xi Jinping to the threat that the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown posed in 1986 to Mikhail Gorbachev's hold on the Soviet Union. I'm wondering whether, in your opinion, that is a comparison that holds merit.
I think to a degree it does, but the Xi Jinping government is not facing a meltdown of the economy that the Soviet Union was experiencing when the Chernobyl crisis broke out. So the depth of unhappiness that was existing at that point in time to be exploited was much deeper in the Soviet Union than in China.
Okay, so you don't think that the economic situation is as bad, even though this is all happening on the backdrop of a global economic slowdown?
Because the Soviet Union at that point actually had negative growth rates. So output was declining. In the case of China, output was still increasing, albeit at a lower rate than before.
Right. The other comparison that's made in the press and with analysts is, of course, the Sars outbreak in 2003, the management of SARS then and the management of COVID-19 now. China's National Health Commission came out to say that the current outbreak is preventable and controllable. That was the expression they used. And they said also that in terms of medicine, in terms of social affairs management, and in terms of public opinion management, China has learned its lesson from SARS and is not about to make the same mistakes. But in the last couple of weeks, have we seen that borne out? The self-perception that they've learned from SARS, did they really learn the lessons of SARS applied to the COVID-19 outbreak?
The fact that the comparison with Chernobyl was made shows that a large segment of the public thinks that if the lessons were learned, for some reasons they were not put into action. And is it because of incompetence, or is it because of the nature of the governance in China?
Right. In fact, I understand that one of the other ways of thinking about this is the narratives that have been spun from the Chinese government itself about what happened. And I believe one of the narratives is that essentially there was a failure of leadership at a provincial level, and that it was Beijing, the central leadership, that came in and saved the day. Is that how you see it?
Well, at this point, I cannot tell what is happening. Largely because there is a report that Xi Jinping realized what was happening in early January, and he had issued instructions to deal with the problem, including warning the public in a timely fashion should it be an outbreak like SARS. We know that the public dissemination of the epidemic was certainly slow, well behind the curve, and that means this failure occurred at the local level. This, I think, is likely to have been the case, but for people who are skeptical, it could be seen as an exercise in trying to push the blame trying to make a scapegoat out of the local officials. Because in an interview, the Wuhan mayor said that, of course I want to get the information out and save people, But in cases like this, I need to be authorized to review the situation. That particular command means that this person is pushing the blame upwards. And after this interview was when we hear about Xi Jinping having issued the command to deal with the problem accordingly.
I want, before we get deeper into the political side of it, I mean, just in terms of the economics of it, because I know you do quite a bit of work on economic policy and in China. Tell us about what is understood about the damage that COVID-19, because the numbers are dramatic, shutdown of a province, shutdown of a city, millions of people.
Supply chain disruptions.
Quarantine of workers, commodity prices have fallen. Apparently, copper is a bellwether of Chinese economic health. Those prices have fallen. Does anybody have a grasp of what the overall picture is in terms of the economic damage?
One thing for sure, the output for the first 3 months of the year will be very, very low because the country is basically in quarantine. Output started slowing down because of the coming Chinese New Year on January 25th. So you could say for half a month in January, there was minimal production. February, generally, work could have resumed in February 17th, but in fact that has not happened. So January is very low growth. Well, I mean low level production. February, even lower production. And from what we see, March will be pretty much like February.
It's quite a grim picture.
Largely because the Chinese universities that were anticipated to open in the second half of February. And then the rumors are that it will now open in April. I understand that the Ministry of Education announced that in-class instruction will resume only after the May 1st holiday.
Wow.
So this means that in-class instruction will not occur until 8th of May. But the important thing is they are therefore anticipating that the risk of infection will continue to be high at least until the middle of April. And what that means is the country will still be quarantined until the middle of April. So we are talking about 3 full months of low level of production.
Right.
So the growth rate for the year is unlikely to hit 6% if the production remains low in both March and April.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and come back, continue this conversation with Professor Woo shortly on Consider This. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you. We're speaking tonight to Professor Woo Wing Thye, who is with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. And we're talking a little bit about the economic impact of the COVID-19 outbreak. Just before the break, you predicted that this is going to be a period of slow growth for China because of the COVID outbreak. Talk to us about what you expect economic policymakers in China to do, or how they're going to react to this expected slowdown. Will we be looking at an economic stimulus package?
Oh, that's definitely, it's already been implemented. Basically, they are going to keep the firms operating by extending very low interest loans, a large part of which they would expect to write off because these firms are not getting revenue. So low interest loans, they still have to pay it back. So I think it will basically printing money to get them over this bad patch, which is the correct thing to do.
Is it going to be enough?
It will not be enough to push growth up above 6%.
I want to ask about the other side of this, because just not the health of the enterprise, but also workers. I mean, does China ever go through a situation that workers are let off or lose their jobs as a consequence of slowdown? And is that a likely scenario here as well?
Well, quite a large part of the factory workforce are migrant workers. And the migrant workers are paid according to the amount of production they have been engaged in.
So this would be migration within China?
These are people who are from the countryside coming to the city to work. This is migration within China. Right. These people, well, they will not come back in any case because of the epidemic. So they will suffer a big income loss for these migrant workers.
So you talked about this, the economic impact in China. China being one of the superpowers of the economic superpowers of the world, what is the impact then to the rest of us? When China sneezes, the rest of us catch a cold?
Well, we can see it right here in Malaysia. Due to a large decline of Chinese tourists, the price of Musa King has fallen down to half of what it was in December.
I mean, that might leave a smile on many Malaysian faces, by the way.
Yeah. The consumer in Malaysia comes off smelling roses, but a recession stings in any case.
Sure.
Right. I want to ask about this. I mean, so what are the political implications? Job losses or declining incomes, do they lead necessarily to instability in China? Do Chinese workers' organizations mobilize around these moments? What is the likely scenario from that end, especially in terms of the legitimacy of the central government?
I think that the very decisive action since mid-February has shown a government that is looking out for the lives of the population, certainly redeems the negative image of incompetence at the local level. It does shake confidence that the lessons that were learned in the Sars outbreak were not applied. And there is concern about if Xi Jinping knew about it and he asked for it to be done, why is it that the people he had picked to be in charge in Wuhan did not react appropriately? Is it because they were incompetent, or is it because there was something in the system that prevents them from reacting in time? And what would be it in the system that prevented them from reacting in time? That could be that the system is overly paranoid about being undermined by actions by individuals. It's not even actions by organized group. I can understand why a government feels threatened by the actions of an organized group. But the action of a doctor like Li Wenliang, who warned his friends, hey, there is something very nasty in that ward in my hospital, and it might be something like SARS. So watch out, guys. This is one individual. And he was clearly not engaged in an organized activity. And yet he was reprimanded. And the tragedy is he then caught disease and died. And there's a lot of anger of, isn't this a little bit too concerned about being challenged all the time.
Right.
Yeah,
the party is strong, and why should we need to be so paranoid about being challenged?
This is very interesting, and it's the logic of authoritarian regimes. But we also know of, and it's being reported now, a prominent Chinese scholar, a law professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing, has come out in a letter to criticize the Beijing leadership. Another one has come out to call, in fact, for Xi Jinping to resign. I mean, these are these extraordinary moments? Looking from the outside, it seems extraordinary, but is it? For this kind of dissent in China?
No, it just shows that the Chinese, there's more, there's certainly great varieties of opinion, and they clearly have not been able to organize themselves. But there are potential sources of challenge. But if they are not organized, just like they interpreted the action of Dr. Li Wenliang, I think the government could be overreacting to individual actions. But there is a difference between deleting the messages of these people versus deleting and arresting these people. And as far as I know, these people have not been arrested.
Well, I want to come back very quickly to what you brought up, Dr. Li, right? And following his death, that opened the floodgates to grief and I think unprecedented dissent in a way.
Yes, there was a whole bunch of people, academics, signing a petition asking for freedom of speech in China, so that at least we can warn each other in time.
And then you talked about whether, you know, if it gets deleted after 30 seconds, perhaps there's no traction there. Has that unprecedented outpouring of grief and dissent had much traction until later, until today and onwards?
Right now, I cannot judge. But given the great number of references in different websites I have seen, the grief is certainly very widespread, deeply felt, and how much of it will get translated into action, we really do not know. Because the government has not finished solving the problem yet.
Has the government responded in any way to this call for more transparency and more freedom of expression?
No, it has not. But however, it could have implications in the future of how would the state restore social trust. That is a very key consideration.
And on that note, we're going to take a quick break, come back and continue this conversation about social trust. Stay tuned to consider this. Thank you for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Melisa, Idris. With me, Sharaad, Kuttan. Tonight we're speaking to Professor Woo Wing Thye from Sunway University. He's also with the Institute of Population and Labour Economics of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. Now, you mentioned social trust just before the break, and I'm just wondering, you know, an epidemic cannot be won, or cannot be fought and won unless the bonds of trust between governments and people can survive the grief, as we talked about earlier, the confusions, the emotions, the fear, and the medical challenges of fighting an epidemic. Now, what can the Chinese central government do to recover some of that lost social trust?
I think first, given that the local officials have been identified to have been largely responsible for this Chernobyl sort of misbehavior. So they have found the offenders and they have been removed from the post. I think how they would generate support for the party, but not necessarily trust, continue support and continue and prevent efforts from active organization against the party, would be to show that the party still excel in economic management. They would, if they are able to bring growth up to 7 to 8% next year in 2021.
Right.
And do that for 4 or 5 years, I think people would have felt that the party, on balance, is good for China and something that we don't have, there's no need to actively, in fact it will be against their interest to actively hamper its working.
So as long as there is economic prosperity, it can offset whatever the management of the COVID-19 outbreak.
Or the mismanagement. I want to ask you about the potential for reform. I know there is perhaps this outsider view of China that China is waiting to become democratic, and people have waited decades for this moment. But is there at least an impulse for reform, for democratization or devolving of power, the ability to institutionalize dissent and make it acceptable because it could have positive effects for society? Is China on that road at all?
Well, the question is, are there economic reforms that could be undertaken that does not pose a threat to the control of the party? The answer is yes, there are still economic reforms that, if undertaken, will boost growth, and this sort of reform would not have the negative impact on the power of the Communist Party.
But not political reforms?
Because it is possible to heighten growth without these political reforms. Specifically, you can see 2 areas for reform in China that could kick up growth. One reform is to reform the market for the financial industry, reform rural land ownership, reform the household registration system, which is the one that keeps people tied to land. These 3 reforms, the reform of the banking system, which would allow private enterprises to get capital in a normal manner, the reform of rural land, basically giving land to the peasants, will enable these people to start their own businesses, and the freeing of people from living where they were born will boost economic growth by allowing labor to flow to places of labor shortage. This boost to economic growth will not challenge the whole of the Communist Party. There's another kind of challenge, let me be quick, that could boost growth but challenge the control of the party, is to privatize the state-owned enterprises, because these are instruments through which the party dispenses to reward its followers.
Right.
So of these 2 types of reform, they still can do the first type rather than the reform of the party. And that will push economic growth up, and that will also enhance China's position in the world if China continues its high growth.
I mean, finally, we have about a minute left. I mean, do you think that China has come, and the Chinese government has come out smelling roses at the end of this? Because one of the narratives was that China made huge sacrifices for the rest of the world. It contained it in Wuhan, in Hubei, and therefore saved the world. Is that a narrative you think is persuasive outside of China?
I don't think it will be incredible even within China itself. It's thank God we managed to contain it and move on with life. That is a sense of relief more than a sense of gratitude.
Well, hopefully we learn the lessons from the COVID-19 outbreak, for the next, and in preparation for perhaps the next outbreak. Thank you so much, Professor Woo, for being on the show today and sharing your insights.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Melisa, Idris, with me, Sharaad, Kuttan, signing off for tonight. Thank you so much for watching and good night.